In the previous lesson, we created these basic ground patterns by taking a diamond net and punching some holes in it. In this lesson, we're going to put some of these pieces together to fill in any space. And we're going to look at 3 different ways of doing that. So let's see what that looks like. The pattern that you've been working on is probably looking a little bit smudged by now with all these erasing and drawing of lines. So let's tidy it up by going over it with some marker. First thing we'll do is take our marker and mark out pins in the inside. So everywhere you have 2 pencil lines that intersect, draw a dot representing a pin, and this will become our pricking later on. So here we have another X and another X. So we get 3 pins on the inside of this pattern. We'll also have a look at the border of our pattern. So every place that a pencil line touches the border, draw a dot for a pin. Notice that there are no dots at the tip of the arrows. There are no pencil lines here, so there are no dots. Then we're going to take our marker and draw a thin line between the pins to show the flow of pairs through the pattern. Now where you have a vertical line in your drawing that's right on the border, either on the right border or on the left border, I'd like you to draw it with a little bit of a curve, just for these ones that are right on the outside of the pattern, on the edge. And I'll explain why we want to do this later on. When we're marking the pins, this is the most important place for accuracy. So you want the pin points on the border to be exactly at the intersection of the grid lines. So line your pin up carefully and make your dot. And for the pins on the interior, look for the intersection of your pencil lines. And again, you can use the grid behind it as your guide and make your dots. Switching to a thinner pen, I'm going to draw in the pair lines. So I like to do the vertical lines first. And remember here on the left-hand side where we have a vertical edge right at the border, I'm going to draw the line with a bit of a curve. And same on the right-hand side, we have a vertical line, so I'm going to draw it with a bit of a curve. Then I do the lines in one diagonal. These lines don't have to be as accurate, they're just guides. The only thing that really has to be accurate is the pinpoints. And now I'm going to draw the lines in the other diagonal. Now I'm just going to give that a second or two to dry, and then I will erase my pencil lines. Okay, so here's our template, and we're going to take some tracing paper and make copies of it and create our pattern. So the first thing I'm going to do is just tape that template down so it doesn't move around, and then put my tracing paper on top of it. And I'm going to be making multiple rows and multiple columns of this pattern, so I don't want to stick it right in the corner, but I want to stick it somewhere towards the top left corner of the page. I just want to leave a bit of room here because later on I'm going to draw a border around the pattern. So now let me tape down the tracing paper as well. And we'll start tracing this template. So the first thing I do is I mark the pinpoints, so the dots. And this part, you need to be as accurate as possible. This is the most important part, so take your time. You can use the grid lines as a means for lining up where your dots are for precision, or you can just carefully look at where the lines cross. Then I'm going to use another marker, a fine marker, to mark in the black lines. Now notice I'm not going to trace the red border on the top and bottom or the blue border on the left and right, just the black lines that I have. So again, I'll do the vertical ones. Here on the side I have a curved line, but when I'm tracing it, I'll just make that straight. Same on this side. And then my diagonal lines. For the lines, accuracy is not as important. What you need to be able to see is where the threads go. So know that it starts at one pin and goes to the next pin, but for accuracy we don't really care if the line is perfectly straight. It can have a bit of a wiggle. Okay, and that is the first copy of tracing my template. The simplest way to arrange our patterns is like a spreadsheet. So we have rows and columns neatly aligned. So let's start by drawing a row. We've traced the pattern once, and now we slide the pattern to the left and line it up so that the 3 pins on the right-hand side of our tracing sit exactly on top of the 3 pins that are on the left-hand side of our template. So we line those 2 edges up, and then we can trace this pattern over again. And we can keep going as far as we like down the row. To make a column, we take our traced pattern, we're going to slide the tracing paper up, and we're going to line it up so that the 3 pins at the bottom of our tracing line up exactly with the 3 pins that are at the top of our template underneath. So 3 at the bottom of the tracing on top of 3 at the top of our template. And after we've traced that, we can slide it up and do that again to create a column. So now let's see what it looks like when we trace a spreadsheet arrangement of this pattern. So I'm going to take my first copy that I've traced and put it over my template, and now I'm just going to slide it so the tracing paper slides to the left. And what I want to do is take the pins that are on the far right side on the tracing paper and line them up with the pins that are on the far left side of my template. So they should lie exactly on top of each other. And again, this is the important part, so take your time and make it as accurate as possible. And then I'll take my tracing paper down and trace. So I'll start with the pins, and you'll notice that the first pins on the left-hand side of this template have already been traced. And now the lines. And I'm going to make a third copy in this row. So I'm going to take my tracing paper up and again slide it over so that the pins on the right hand side of the tracing paper line up with the pins on the left hand side of my template. Another thing you can do when you're lining this up is use the grid behind it. So those points that I've traced already should fall on grid points. So you can use that to make sure that you're getting good, accurate lining up. All right, pin it down again and trace. So there we have a row, and you can make this row as long as you want. Just keep doing the same thing, sliding your paper. But now we're going to look at the next row. So I take my tracing paper, and now I'm looking at these pins that are on the left-hand side, the bottom pins this time. So this is the bottom of my first trace, these 3 pins. And I'm going to line those 3 pins with the top 3 pins of my template. So whatever pins are in the top of your template. And make sure that it's nice and accurate. And again, you can use the grid to help you line up your other pins. Keep it nice and accurate. Take the paper down and trace again. Now that I have traced the first copy in this row, the next part is just the same as doing the previous row. I take my template, slide it over, and now I'm looking at these pins at the far right side of my tracing paper and lining them up with the left side of my template. And that's my second copy, and I'll make a third copy. When you're positioning this, you'll notice that in addition to lining up the right side of that row with the left side of the template, the bottom of the previous row will align with the top of the template. So you have lots of points now for accurately lining up your tracing paper. It's important to line it up accurately, so take your time. So now I've completed 2 rows, and I'm just going to do a third row. So again, I'm using the spreadsheet, so I want to line the bottom 3 pins on the left-hand side with the top 3 pins of the template. And trace. And just complete the row. Okay, so now we've completed a 3x3, 3 rows and 3 columns spreadsheet layout. Now you should recognize this as your Paris ground or cat ground. So we have our hexagonal holes going on the diagonals and also in columns. We can also arrange copies of the pattern like bricks in a wall. So here again we have rows, but each row, instead of lining up at the left-hand side, is staggered a little bit to the right from the row above it. So we have a little bit of an indent here, and the same amount of indent here. So let's see what that looks like in practice. So let's say we've traced A is our first row. So we have A1, A2, A3, and so on. Now we come to do our second row. So here's the tracing of our first row. And here we're trying to position B1. So in this case, instead of putting the 3 pins at the bottom of our tracing lining directly on top of the 3 pins at the top of our template, we just shift them over. So here pin number 2 from the tracing is on top of pin number 1 at the top of the template. And now that we trace B1, and then we can continue down on this B row the same as we did for the previous row. And now we're going to come to the third row. We'll do exactly the same thing. So here will be the tracing we did at the left of the second row. And we're going to position our tracing so that the second pin at the bottom of the tracing is on top of the first pin of the template, at the top of the template. Okay. And then we just trace our template and continue on for the rest of the row, and so on. Using the same Paris ground template, we're going to draw a brick wall pattern. So I'm going to start by making a row of 3 copies. Now that we have a row of 3 copies, we're going to start the second row. But this time, instead of lining the pattern up directly underneath this first copy, we're going to shift the pattern to the left by 1 pin. So notice now that this second pin from the traced copy lines up with the first pin of the template. And just put that in place and make a copy. We're going to complete this row just by sliding the paper to the right. Actually, the paper will go to the left, and make 2 more copies. So just slide the paper to the left as we did for the spreadsheet, and continue making copies. So notice how the second row is indented a little bit, and also that it sticks out a little bit after the first row. And I'm going to complete this by doing a third row. So again, I come up here, and instead of aligning my template directly under the previous row, I'm going to slide it over by 1 pin. And now I'm just going to trace the third row. Okay, so now we have 3 by 3 wall by rows. So we have 3 rows, and you'll notice that each row gets indented a little bit. And similarly on the left-hand side, they stick out a little bit. So we've used the same basic pattern for the first one and the second layout, but notice there's a difference. Now we're getting these holes that are almost twice as tall. So what's happening now is the bottom of this hole is not lining with the top to make a hexagon. It's sliding one over to line up with this top. So this bottom lines up with this top. And that gives us a much taller hole. The holes are still on a diagonal, and we also have this diagonal row of diamonds surrounded by 4 triangles. Notice that instead of having all of the pins on the left-hand side in a nice column, like we did with the spreadsheet, now we have 3 pins, and then it goes over by 1, and then we get the next 3 pins, and over by 1, and then the next 3 pins. And that's our indentation to make these rows offset a little bit. Let's talk about what happens when you have a vertical line on the right-hand side of your pattern and it lies directly on top of a vertical line on the left side of your pattern. What's going to happen is these 2 pins are actually the same pins, as these 2 pins are also the same pin. And we're going to have 2 pairs going between these pins, as shown here. So here we have our pins, and those 2 red vertical lines are actually pairs between the same set of pins. So we want to draw them as 2 pairs. And remember, you could work this as a plait or a tally or a pin chain or a Venetian cord or any number of different ways. But we need to mark on our pattern that we have 2 pairs coming into this pin and then 2 pairs that go together somehow down, and then at the bottom pin they separate. So you'll recall at the beginning of this lesson, I recommended that you draw the vertical lines on the border with a bit of a curve. And the reason I wanted you to do that is that when you place your tracing on top of the template, your tracing will have a straight line, and you should be able to see that curved line just sticking out a little bit as you go to trace the second copy, and that should give you a little indication that you want to draw your double pair symbol. And let's look at a third way to take the same pattern and lay it out to get a different result. It's very similar to the brick wall, but this time we're going to have vertical columns, and each column will be indented down a little bit. And the indent will be the same each time, the same distance. So to start, let's create our first column. Recall from creating this spreadsheet example, to create a column, you just trace a copy and then slide the traced copy up so that the pins at the bottom of the tracing line up with the pins at the top of our template. Trace your pattern again and continue sliding and tracing. So this will give us our first column. Now we want to position the second column. So the way we do that is we take the top of our first column and we position it so that the pins on the right-hand side of the tracing line up with the pins on the left-hand side of the template, but then slide your tracing up so that the second pin lines up with the first row of pins. And that will give us our little bit of indent. And then we can just trace this pattern and then go back to the tracing a column technique to finish the rest of this column. And then when we go to do our third column, it's the same thing. So here is the top of our second column, and we want to trace the top of our third column. We just slide our tracing paper up so that those right pins of the traced copy line up with the leftmost pins of the template, and then slide it so that the second pin is in line with the first row in the template. Trace it to give the top of our column, and then just keep sliding your template up to finish the rest of the column. Now notice here, what we did when we lined our two columns up is we have our vertical pair, and then you can just see the shadow of a second pair. So this pair will actually be two pairs going between the pin, which we'll draw with our S. The end result will be a column of these double pairs. So these could be tallies or pin chains. And we get hexagons beside each other with a little double pair between them. So you can think of this like Mechelin ground, which has a pin chain between the hexagons. But unlike the Mechelin ground, instead of having a whole bunch of these hexagons, we just have pairs of them. So here's a pair of hexagons, here's another, and over here we have other pairs. So we get these vertical columns of double hexagons, and then a staggered pattern between the columns of double hexagons. So now we can see that the same template has provided us with a third completely different arrangement. For this third layout, again I'm going to use the same template, but this time I'm going to create columns that are offset. So the first thing to do is create a column. So again, I'm going to line my tracing paper up and tape it down. And trace out one copy. To make a column, now I'm going to move my tracing paper up and align the bottom of my trace with the top of my template. So I'm just going to slide it up, and now the three pins that are on the bottom of my traced copy are going to line up with the three pins at the top of my template. And I'm going to make another copy. And one more time to make a third copy. So now we've traced one column, and this column looks just like the first column of our spreadsheet layout. Now we're going to position the second column. Take our pattern tracing paper and line it up over a template. Now we're not going to put it exactly beside the first column like we did for the spreadsheet. Instead, we're just going to shift it up by one pin. So now the second pin on the right hand side of the traced copy is going to line up with the first pin on the left hand side of the template. So get that in position. And now I will trace my pins. All right, when I'm tracing the lines, when I come to this straight line here, if you look closely, you can just see a curved line behind that straight line. What this means is we're going to have two pairs that go between these two pins. So the first pair came from the first traced copy, and the second pair will come from the second traced copy. So I just draw my little symbol for two pairs. Then I can draw in the rest of the lines. Now I can just slide my pattern up and do the next copy in the column. And take your time when you're placing your paper. Accuracy is important here. So again, I can just make out the curve of the line underneath this one. So this becomes a double pair. and one more copy in this column. So now I've completed the second column, I'll make a third column. So again, for the third column, I'm not going to line it up exactly beside the first 3 pins at the top of the second column. I'm going to slide the second column up, and so that the second pin on the right hand side of my tracing paper lines up with the first pin of my template. And now I'll trace the third column. Always look for that doubled up pair with the little curved line. Okay, so now we've completed 3 by 3 copies of a wall with columns. Now notice that each column is indented by the same amount each time. So if we look at our pins across the top, we have 3 in a row, but then we go down and we have the next 3. And we go down by 1 pin and we have the third group of 3. Also notice that we have our hexagons, but here we have 2 hexagons that are side by side with a plait or a tally or a pin chain in between them. So a pin chain would be like the Mechelin ground. And these pairs of hexagons that are side by side repeat along the diagonal in both diagonals. So now you've seen a third way to arrange the same template and get a slightly different pattern. As our pattern gets larger, we have even more options for sliding. So notice here I now have 4 pins across the top, whereas the cat stitch only had 3. And I have 4 pins down the side, whereas the cat stitch only had 3. So let's see how that gives us more options. A quicker way to see all the different options is just to trace 3 rows of the pattern. And now I'm going to tape down the middle row, and then I can just slide the copies in place. So here everything lines up on the left hand side, and I get the spreadsheet arrangement. So I have my rows and I also have vertical columns that are straight. Notice that I have a hole that has 6 sides, and also I'll call these double pairs tallies. My tallies are aligned in vertical lines. All right, so I can now slide my pattern over. So I have to slide the top and the bottom over so that I get the same indent for all the time. So I have an indent of one and an indent of another one. Notice now that the tallies are sort of on a diagonal, and I've also have the shape appearing out here that's like an arabesque or a bobble shape. I can slide them over another time. And now notice that I have these straight lines appearing. If I slide them over one more time, you'll see I'm back to having these vertical columns. So I'm back to the same spreadsheet arrangement. And I can do the same thing with the columns. So I trace 3 columns and tape down the middle one. If I arrange them so that the tops are all even, I'll get my spreadsheet arrangement. So I'll have my rows as well as my columns. And notice I have a black edge and a red edge, so this should be drawn as the symbol for 2 pairs, like a tally or a plait. Here I have tallies in a vertical line as we saw before. Now if I slide it up by 1 and the right side down by 1, notice that the tallies disappear. So now I don't have double edges where the patterns meet. And if I slide them up one more time and down another time, okay, so now I have a vertical indent of 2 pins at each column. Now I'm getting this kind of a bow tie shape, so a triangle, a square, and a triangle here along the diagonal. And if I slide them one more time, and now I have these straight horizontal rows, so I'm back to the spreadsheet arrangement. Okay, now it's your turn. I would like you to make samples from each of the 3 different layouts. You could start with the cat ground template and see if you can get the same results that I have showing here, just to make sure you understand the concepts. But then I would like you to try 1 or 2 of the grounds that you've created by punching holes in the diamond net and see what they look like when you repeat them. Pay attention to how the holes at the top and bottom of the pattern line up and what kind of shapes you can get.